Okay, everybody, welcome to this week's episode of Build Amazing Things Securely. I'm your host, Laura Bell-Main, and it is my absolute pleasure today to welcome our guest, Dr. Vaughan Shanks, the CEO and founder of Cydarm Technologies, but I'll let him introduce himself. He's going to be doing it much better than I can. And he's going to talk to us about something in the authentication space that we should all be a little bit excited about. So welcome, Vaughan.
Thanks for having me on the show, Laura. Really appreciate it.
Right. Vaughan, not a problem at all. I am absolutely thrilled to be understanding about this new technology today. But before we get into that, I would love to hear about yourself. So who are you, Vaughan? What brings you here and what is it you do in the world?
Well, so first and foremost, I'm a software engineer. I've got a computer science background. I'm a builder of things. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm also, should we say, an information security aficionado. I've been passionate about InfoSec since I read The Cuckoo's Egg way back in the 1990s. And yeah, flash forward to today, I've worked in, on the way, I worked in the government space in the Australian Department of Defence and abroad, and then worked for a Silicon Valley software vendor and started my own venture a bit over 5 years ago, Cydarm Technologies. So I've been running this company since then.
Wow, that's pretty exciting. Now, for those who are listening or watching who haven't come across The Cuckoo's Egg, it is a great book. Highly recommend if you want a vintage trip down memory lane of how hacking used to work. So it's lovely to have that brought up again. So you've had quite the adventure, and it's awesome to meet somebody who's moved from the engineering space into the cybersecurity space. So tell us, Vaughan, what is the technology that you are excited about? What's the amazing thing that we should be doing?
Well, today I'm excited about attribute-based access control, or ABAC, as it is known.
All right. Okay. All right. So before we lose everyone at the start, can you explain, well, not like I'm five, because to be honest, 5-year-olds have no attention span, but explain it to us. Vaughan, what is this and why should we be excited about it too?
So there's a lot of talk about zero trust. And I realize I have to put $1 in the swear jar for using that term.
Absolutely.
But there is a lot of talk about that, and there's a lot of talk that it's impossible and it's an aspiration that no one can ever reach. And I just want to say I have seen it, and I saw it about 15 years ago when I was working in the public service for the Australian Department of Defence, and that is just how they did things. And one of the ideas that was introduced along the way that I learned about and is only just starting to gain relevance is attribute-based access control. And so this is a really important part of a zero trust architecture, because you need to not only enforce people's identity when they connect to systems and in between systems, but you then also need to figure out what are their authorizations. And so ABAC is a very powerful and flexible and convenient system that works very well in the government space. And I think it's got a lot of application in the private sector as well. And my interest in this is because we make a platform at Cydarm Technologies for security incident response, or cyber response management, as we're calling it these days. And one thing that has really struck me is that cyber response is a team sport. There's a lot of people that have a part to play. So talking about a security operations team, the teams that are adjacent to that, and then industry peers, regulators, and other providers in the space. So and that collaboration,
right.
Yeah.
This is pretty cool. Now, Vaughan, forgive me, but we're going to unpick a few bits here. So remembering our audience are software engineers of all shapes, sizes, and forms. We're going to let's give them the quick refresher that they need, the minimum viable knowledge, if you will, for what is zero trust. So we hear this term bandied around a lot. You even suggested a swear jar for it, and I'm with you on that. So what's the simplest explanation you can give of that?
Well, let's put aside the marketing jargon for a second and go back to how it's defined by the United States government, who I think actually borrowed the idea from Google's Beyond Corp paper from must be like 12, 13 years ago. So what it is, it's a system by which we essentially have isolation between different components in a network or an IT infrastructure that minimizes the possibility of lateral movement of an attacker being able to exploit a foothold and move into other parts of a network. It also, I think, is a a tip of the hat to the modern reality where we have people working from all over the world, often on mobile workstations or even mobile phones, and there is no perimeter anymore. There's no hard boundary of a firewall, and we sit inside an office with our workstations plugged into the Ethernet. Really, the boundary with all of the SaaS services we're using and the distribution of employees is very broad. And so Zero Trust has these 6 pillars. It's got identity, devices, applications, networks, infrastructure, and data. And it defines, it's really a standard, very well defined, with lots of documentation that defines how we secure these objects or these domains with respect to enforcing identity and authorization and all that other good stuff, detection, monitoring, etc.
Awesome. Cool. Now, for many of our audience who haven't encountered that before, all these papers that Vaughan's referencing are freely available online. So we will try and pop some links in the comments so that if you do feel like going a bit deeper, you can. But let's get back to that incident response bit, Vaughan, because I'm intrigued. You like this area enough to be building a product in this space. Now, as somebody who's been silly enough to build a product, this is no mean feat. So what's got you excited about collaborative incident response, and what's Cydarm doing that has you so focused on that mission?
Yeah, what got me excited about it was I realized there was no real standards around how this is done. There are aspirations. So groups like NIST have defined best practice, but in terms of how that's implemented, back in 2017, when I started the company, it seemed to be grab your favorite ticketing system of choice and good luck. You'll need to customize it a lot. And one of the problems we see.
Was every word lead to Jira, Vaughan? Was there a lot of Jira in the mix?
I'm going to avoid throwing any product names under the bus here, but that certainly comes up quite a lot. It's frequently used, and I think it is actually it's validating to see that people have actually thought about using a ticketing system of some kind. We've even seen Excel spreadsheets being used for incident response at, shall we say, very large financial institutions, because they just had nothing else to work with, but they've got a mental model of how they want this to work. Now, where it breaks down is when it comes to collaborating outside that immediate team of responders. So it's easy enough to record notes individually. If you're recording notes amongst a team of trusted insiders, there are ticketing platforms that can let you do that. But then what do you do when you need to invite, say, contractors like a managed service who are doing tier 1 monitoring for you, or to, I guess, working more in your domain, Laura, when you have developers who are the only people that know how to secure their own products, that they know there's an issue, they know there's a DevSecOps call to action that they need to fix this issue in a hurry, and they need partial visibility of what the security team is doing, but not everything. You don't want to invite them onto your ticketing platform and have them see literally all the data. And so what I realized,
and to be honest, as an engineer, Vaughan, I don't think I want to see all that data. I've read enough security papers now to know that nothing good will come. So you're talking about these kind of stakeholders coming in. Sorry to have interrupted you there, but I want to make sure that we really get those details while we're talking about that part. So we've got engineers come in, and I love to hear that we have a key part to play in incident response, that, it is our world too, which for many of our audience, that might not be something you've been around or been aware of. So you've got tier 1 people, you have service providers, and this collaboration then is really, really important. What kinds of data are you sharing?
Yeah, so the name of the game here is collaboration at different levels of trust and expertise. So for example, a software developer might need to know, or a DevOps person might need to know, when we first became aware of this incident, how were we notified that the software had a bug? It could be a log4j type of situation. We found what looks like malicious traffic, and there is code executing on your host right now. Your application is being exploited. DevSecOps people need to know the timeline of events. They need to be able to see the evidence of what's happening right now, so that they can react with the appropriate level of urgency, and they can focus their effort on damage control and then on containment going forward. And I think this is the reason this is challenging, is because you don't want those people to be also looking at your insider threat cases, which might be stored in the same ticketing system. which they have no business looking at. So in the government, we call this need to know. And it's balancing that need to know with the need to share.
Is there a certain size organization, do you think, Vaughan, that has more of this need to know division? So, we build software in tiny teams and large organizations and large government departments. Is it universally true that there's that division, or is it something you grow into?
Like a lot of these technologies, I think it starts with a really big, sophisticated, well-resourced organizations. So, top-tier banks, top-tier telcos, very obvious need to collaborate between parts of the organization and to be able to move at speed and not spill sensitive data. I think what's happening, though, is security is being democratized. So we're seeing security permeating lower and lower down into smaller and smaller organizations. And security practices now are, I would say, in the light of recent events, certainly here in Australia, are good security practices are known by many people you could bump into on the street. So I think being able to react to a security incident like any other sort of incident, being able to be aware of the risk and manage the risk, I think is going to become more and more a part of the everyday for DevOps teams.
Yeah, absolutely. It does sound like it. So this comes back to our technology of choice, Vaughan. Tell us what the link is. How do we, embrace incident response and be part of this as part of the solution and use this technology? How's that technology going to help us?
All right, so most people will have heard of role-based security, and that's basically where when you log in, the system you log into is aware of what your job role is, and based on that, it lets you do certain things and not do certain other things. ABAC is, so role-based access control is, you can think of it as a one-dimensional access control system where you have a job role and your job role lets you do things. ABAC, attribute-based access control, is multi-dimensional. So job role might be one of the attributes associated with your user profile. There might be an attribute that says what nationality you are. And in government, this is very important because we're sharing data across international boundaries with our partners. We might even have foreign people working alongside us in the office. And in government, there's some data you just can't show them, but you want to collaborate and be as open as you can be. There could be attributes to do with what organization you work for. So, whether you're an internal member of the organization that is managing this risk, or you're an external contractor or retainer that's helping out. And so what you're doing is when a person logs in, you're assigning these attributes to them based on who they are, maybe also where they're logging in from, what time of day it is. You might change their attributes. And then you have basically a policy engine that makes split-second decisions in real time about what objects they're allowed to discover, read, write, and update. And that's
really
basically
cool.
Yeah.
I love it. So, thinking, with my data nerd hat on, and like most engineers, that sounds to me like there's really an infinite set of these attributes that you could associate with an individual or an account or an entity. And the flexibility of that sounds great. That sounds like you can make really fine-grained decisions. So what's the catch, Vaughan? Why isn't this everywhere? Why has it taken so long to adopt?
I think the catch is that step one is you have to put access control lists on objects. And if you have a platform where you haven't done that, retrofitting that can be quite difficult. It's the sort of thing you want to bake in from the get-go and have a way to label every object with at least an access control list. You can change it later, but you've got to have that affordance built in. The other part is, I think it is at first blush more complex. I mean, it's very easy to say, I am an admin. That is to say, I'm an Australian, I'm an admin, I am, work for organization ABC, and I'm coming from this particular network right now. How you do those combinatorics to figure out what access I have to what objects is obviously, that's the algorithm that's the secret sauce of ABAC. And at first blush, it can seem like that's a lot more difficult than just saying, I'm an admin, give me super user access to everything. I think, though, when you start getting into more nuanced situations, like, okay, I work at a multinational company, we've had a data spill, it pertains to users in Europe. And, as like people who are not European should not be looking at this data because we don't want to have a second data spill. We don't want our outsourced provider to look at it. And we have to make sure the data doesn't leave Europe. We want to be able to share the sensitive data with those people who need to know. And by the way, we're going to bring in this other organization who are going to collaborate with us on the solution. And when you start breaking it down into, well, how many roles do we need to represent a larger organization with lots of relationships? And think of a Venn diagram, and when you have 3 circles on a Venn diagram, you've got effectively, 7 regions that you can define. Now, if you throw a whole lot of circles onto that Venn diagram, each one of those has to become a role. It starts to get really out of hand quickly. So this is where ABAC scales a lot better than ABAC.
Now, like once upon a time, I had a very misguided period in a payments company, and we had a very fine-grained permission system. So every single function had multiple layers of controls on it. Now, back then, I was asked to go and test it. So go and test all of the different combinations of these fine-based controls. Has that space gotten any easier? How would you, as an engineer, make sure that you're really testing out all of the permutations of those attributes? Or is that a problem that doesn't really apply to ABAC?
I think there's two problems there to unpack. The first one is, does the ABAC policy engine make correct decisions? And that means running a battery of tests that try different combinations and just checking that it can handle the different situations where an access control list has say no attributes from a particular category in it, or it's got 3 different attributes, and how those are combined, and making sure you get the answer you expect. From a point of view of an organization, checking their configuration of ABAC, that really comes down to how well you can understand the rule sets, and whether you're willing to, for example, run a QA environment. If you for simple cases, you wouldn't need to do this. It'll just work the way it's intended. But for maybe a more complex situation, you might want to QA it first and do a few dry runs with some dummy users to make sure you can see what you can see.
This sounds really interesting to me. I know many of us who've built authentication and authorization systems before, and this definitely sounds like it has a lot more potential for being more dynamic than perhaps we have been able to be in the past. So talk me through how this is helping in Cydarm. So you said that you had a need to know basis on your information. How is this being applied?
So really, it starts becoming relevant as soon as within a security operations team, you might have basically different permissions depending on seniority. But as soon as you go outside that team, you need to start thinking about the other dimensions of the model. And so one that comes up almost immediately is what organization a person works for. So if you have a different organization on the stack, maybe they're a service provider, they might have a limited view. They might be doing tier 1 investigation of new cases and recording basic information, gathering context, but the response is access controlled differently because they actually don't need to know that. They don't need to know what our tradecraft is. Another consideration here is you can have attributes that pertain to users or that would potentially pertain to users who will never actually even get an account on your platform. And here I'm talking about regulators. So if you want to filter the information that gets put into a report and then sent off the platform to someone who needs to maintain a level of trust that you're doing things in a responsible way, you may not want to include every single bit of information that you know about a situation. You just want to stick to the things that they need to know to see you're doing the right things. And so you can have these attributes that pertain to organizations that are not even people on your system. So there's a couple of examples. Others, working with DevOps teams, legal, if it's inside a threat, there's usually an HR angle to it. HR need to have a view on it, but you don't want to overload them with information. If you have a DFIR service on retainer, you don't want them to have access to every single thing. Oh, sorry, digital forensics and incident response. So this is when you've had a really nasty incident and your small security operations team just don't have the resources to deal with it. And you bring in specialist forensic experts, and there's a number of firms that do this. You want to give them that access to your system so they can have the same context as the incident responders in your team. You want that tight collaboration loop. What you don't want is to open the whole system up so they can see your entire history, because they just don't need that information.
Awesome. I can see so much potential here, and it sounds like your platform, Cydarm, is using these technologies to really control what could be a very delicate data situation. So is there any risk with this that we're not aware of? That, is there any way this could go horribly wrong, Vaughan?
Yeah, I guess like any powerful tool, if it's not understood well, and if you're making decisions about data labeling or attribute granting to users, you can expose the wrong data. It's entirely possible. But I think you'd find that with any access control situation. I suppose for those who are trying to build this technology, and I've built this technology now 2 or 3 times over in different roles across my career, there are some compute challenges with this. It's an extra layer of computing that has to be taken into account, and you'll run into scale problems very quickly if you don't have a well thought out schema and some efficient algorithms.
That's really good advice, Vaughan. And I know that our audience, all of us as engineers, we have that tendency to go, how hard could this be? I'll just build one. And it's always nice to know in advance where there might be some dragons. So if we kind of just bring this to its kind of gentle conclusion, what types of organizations, so if you were going to, make some recommendations to folks who are, maybe starting out in this incident response space, and they're facing some of these difficulties you're talking about, and sharing these bits of information that could be very sensitive with these third parties or these interested parties who don't need the full picture. What type of organization, what type of team should be looking at this, and what are your recommended first steps to kind of take a first step into incident response?
I would say government organizations resonate the strongest with this technology, because chances are they're already using this in some guise internally already, even if they don't call it attribute-based access control. So if you've ever seen classified documents, they effectively use a kind of ABAC that even a junior NCO can understand. You see the classification on the document, you know straight away what it means, who's allowed to see it, who's not. So governments get this straight away. I'd say any organization that's in an industry that's government regulated, and the list is growing, is going to need to understand how to control sensitive information and to conform to the requirements of regulators, which often means notifications and sharing and being able to do all of that. I'd say the third category is managed security service providers, or even managed service providers who have a need to implement multi-tenancy. And if you've got a platform that lets you segregate data based on the organization it's from, then that also is a very useful use case for ABAC, and then giving the different people that are providing services different access to subsets of those organizations based on their different trust parameters.
Awesome. Well, you're hearing it here from the person who's done it a few times over in their career. So, if you're in that government space, if you are in a multi-tenancy environment now, I know many of you are, even if you won't admit it out loud, then this could be really powerful for you and what you're doing. But as Vaughan was saying, watch out for those scaling issues, because we all know that a scaling problem you don't spot before you deploy can be an headache and an out of hours triage when you least want it. So Vaughan, if you were to do a call to action off the back of this, we've really enjoyed chatting through your attribute-based access control, ABAC, today, and why you think it is an amazing technology. It's going to help us all. And I agree, your points were very strong. So what's our call to action today? What would you like us to all do off the back of this? And how can we learn more about your work and what you're trying to build in the world?
Okay, so I would say, just stepping back a little bit to where the conversation started, if you've heard that zero trust is a marketing term and you're cynical about it, I'd say take another look. Look for government documentation about it, because the information is out there and it's very specific about what zero trust looks like. And I think that then is naturally will motivate you to understand better what kinds of authorization controls you can put in place. And I'd encourage you to consider ABAC, because I think it's really important that we share this idea and popularize it. To find out more about what Cydarm does, you can see our website. Cydarm is spelled CYDARM.com. And we're doing a 30-day no-cost trials for people who are running a security operations team. You can take the product for a spin and have a look at ABAC for yourself.
Awesome. Now, I know there's a lot of engineers out there who love to play with things, so I'm sure that some of them will be checking that out. Now, as somebody myself who used to work in a government environment, I know that when we say go read a government document, it can seem a little bit daunting, but I promise you there's a lot of value in there, and sometimes we underrate things that come from the government space that, they can be a little bit behind. Sometimes they're just a bit secretive and they're very far ahead. So that's some really great advice, Vaughan. Really love that, and I hope that the folks listening at home can start to dabble in this technology, see if it applies to their world, and maybe even think about where their world touches in incident response. So what they're going to do when bad things happen. Thank you so much for your time today, Vaughan. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Thanks for having me, Laura. An absolute pleasure.